Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael Avery. Great pleasure to be your facilitator this morning. Yes, we are still in the morning session as we gather to discuss a very important report, the XA Global Trade Advisor's third report into import duty investigations. And a warm welcome to the XA Global Trade Advisors team, Donald MacKay, Nadia Fulyun, Tonderai Chabasa, and Annika Jans van Veren, and also to Mike Benfield, the CEO of MacKay, and to all of our delegates. I see we've got a very diverse audience from government, from the private sector, academia, consultants. Consultants don't have a look at the cover of the FM this week. I don't know. It looks like the FM's got it in for consultants at the moment, but Donald, that's something we'll take up after this. But it doesn't really dominate the news cycle as much as it should, this talk on industrial policy. But South Africa's industrial policy and process in particular has major ramifications for economic growth and for job creation. And as we saw with the unemployment figures yesterday, unemployment still far too high in South Africa. Now, it was spelt out in a series of annual industrial policy action plans, the IPAPs, and now sector master plans. And if you look at it, South Africa's industrial policy in the democratic era has been in place for roughly 16 odd years now. Instruments have been chosen to support the manufacturing sector in general. The automotive industry in particular stands out, and certain sectors have been prioritized and received additional support and continue now to do so through the various master plans. But industrial policy is notoriously hard to pin down. If you look at the numbers, though, from a macroeconomic perspective, they just don't lie. Between 1960 and 1994, South Africa's GDP grew at an average of, call it 3.2% per year. From 94, the dawn of democracy, to 2007, which was the year of our first IPAP and our first true industrial policy, GDP grew at a rate of just under 3.5% annually. And then from 2007 to 2020, it grew at 0.9%, or if you cut off at the end of 2019 and thus remove COVID, it averages 1.8%, which is probably a slightly fairer reflection. Now, during that period, unemployment reached a low of 22.4% back in 2007. And as we heard yesterday, currently at 32.6%, still world leading. So I think it's fair to say that our industrial policy attempts haven't yielded the desired results so far. But policy is one thing. Process is something else entirely. And so it's a pleasure to welcome you all here today to unpack the findings of this XA Global Trade Advisor's third report into import duty investigations, which is fundamentally about how a key tariff process is breaking down. We'll have a quick 15-minute presentation from Donald MacKay, the CEO of XA, followed by some time for Q&A. Please keep your Q&A coming in the Q&A chat function available in Zoom. You can type it at any time, and I'll be trying to get through as much of that as possible during the time that we set aside for Q&A. If there's similar questions, we'll just group them all together. After that, we'll bring Mike Benfield, the CEO of MacKay, in for a quick discussion, followed by some more Q&A right at the end, and then we'll conclude this launch, which is being recorded, by the way. So if you want a copy, just email Nadia, that's Nadia, at xagt.com, and Nadia will send you a copy, and we'll also share the links with you to the live dashboard, which is going to be freely available to everyone. But Donald will tell us a little bit more about that later. Now, getting to Denmark is widely adopted as the metaphor for the question of how we transform weak and poor states into well-functioning societies. And Donald, as I hand over to you, reading through the report, it looks like we haven't even left the station on our way to Denmark yet when it comes to the process here. So over to you.
Oh God! It's the
there, I think you've
dreaded. It's the dreaded
there we
mute.
go, Donald.
The dreaded mute. Morning, everyone. Thanks for taking the time out to talk about this. What I think is a really important conversation on why it is that import duty and tariff investigations are taking as long as they do. So when we launched our second report, we I opened that report with the following sentence. I said, if you love localization more than you love ice cream, then getting trade policy working properly is for you. And then as we prepared this report, we realized that nobody loves ice cream. And the analogy, the ice cream cone and the flavors on top work really well for this. So the cone is the process, all of the things that have to happen for these investigations to work properly. You can then pile whatever policies you wish on top, and you can decide that localization is a good idea or it's a bad idea. But the problem is, if the process doesn't work, we simply have no way to measure how well any of these policies are actually operating, which is really the conversation we should be having. And in anticipation of that happening, one of these days, we're going to just start by focusing on the cone for a moment. So for those of you unfamiliar with this, this is the process you go through if you want to get your duties changed. You want to get them increased, perhaps you're a factory. You want to get them reduced. Maybe there's a raw material that you can't source locally and you'd like to get the duties removed. You file your application with the International Trade Administration Commission. They do an audit. They call it a verification. If they're happy with everything, the case initiates. And this is the first time we get to see in the public domain what the case is all about. Interested parties have 4 weeks to respond. They can get a 2-week extension. And when ITAC have received all the responses and they've asked whatever questions they have, they take a decision. And this is the first decision that happens. The second decision is when they've said to the Minister of Trade, we'd like to increase these duties. He thinks on it. And if he agrees, he sends it off to the Minister of Finance. That's the second decision. And the Minister of Finance says, I'm happy with it. And he says to SARS, you need to implement this. Now, the target period to complete all of this in is 6 months. In fact, 4 months if you're in industry in distress, but 6 months would be, I think, a fair point. The average at the moment is 25 months. And how do we know what this period is? Well, ITAC have been writing about this in their annual reports for many, many years now. I've pulled this extract out of their 2012 report, but just about every annual report of theirs has it going back to about 2007. And in this report, it says ITAC revised its timeframes for investigations from 12 to 6 months for normal tariff investigations and to 4 months in the case of tariff investigations for vulnerable sectors. So that's exactly where we get our benchmark from. And we know this is achievable because for the longest time, that's exactly what happened. So in this report, we've gone back 10 years, and this is the picture that emerges. So let me walk you through what you're looking at when you look at this chart. Each of those orange bars represents a 6-month period. The number inside that bar is the average amount of time all of the open investigations, so all of the duty increases, reductions, rebates, all of those that were open as of the last day of that period. So in the first case on the 31st of December 2013, what was the average period all of those open cases were? And they were open for an average of 5 months. If we move to the most recent period, 30th of June 2023, that averaged 5 times greater at 25 months. If you look at the line chart sitting above that, that is for each period, how old was the oldest investigation? And for the first period, we see it was 17 months old, which is 8 months less than the current average. For the current period, the oldest open investigation is 52 months. So an enormous, absolutely enormous deterioration in the performance of these investigations. If you have a look at the line that's just popped up on the screen, that is at the benchmark, that is at the 6 months. And quite coincidentally, 50% of these 6-month periods, investigations were in fact being wrapped up within 6 months. And it's only in the latter half of all of this that we start to see it deteriorating. And you can see from the last half of 2019, the number just keeps on climbing and climbing and shows no sight of getting better. To just demonstrate that same piece of information in a slightly different way, This is the ratio between cases which are open for 6 months or less or for longer. What we are looking for is lots of blue on the screen, because those are the average number of cases the number of cases which were open for less than 6 months at the end of each period, versus orange, which is more. So you see in the first period, about 27% of the cases were open for longer than 6 months. We are now at 92%. And so, again, an enormous deterioration in performance. And then, to give a slightly different but very important perspective, we only get to know how long an investigation sat respectively with ITAC versus the two ministers after the final decision is taken and implemented. And then we get the report and we can see exactly how the time is split. And what we find is the orange bars are the average amount of time spent with ITAC. The blue bars are the average amount of time spent with the two ministers. And the line that you were seeing are the number of investigations that were closed in each period, in other words, finalized. And so what you'll see in the very first period, 4 months, is the average amount of time that a case had been closed. That's the amount of time it had spent with ITAC. There was 1 month typically spent with the ministers, taking us to 5 months. And there were 9 cases finalized in that first half year. By comparison, we are now at 36 months, and we only finalized 1 case in the most recent 6 months. At the beginning of 2022, in fact, no investigations were completed. And the effect of that is shown on this chart. So this chart shows the number of applications that were number of investigations which were initiated by ITAC. And so what you'll see, if we quickly have a look at the line that's just appeared again, the orange bars show us the number of private sector applications, and the blue bar shows us the number of government sector applications. So when ITAC self-initiates, or the minister or DTI request an investigation, we show that as blue. And what you'll see in the most recent period, we had 3 initiations, which is the lowest level we've had in a decade. We had one other period at the end of 2019, which also only had 3 initiations, but you can see right afterwards, those numbers rose quite significantly. The trend here is quite the opposite. If we take the last 12 months, it's the lowest in a decade. If we take the last 18 months, lowest in a decade. And all of this would indicate that at a time of economic distress, which is when we should be seeing the number of these cases rise, as we saw during the COVID period, we see quite the opposite. So there seems to be an opting out, and that certainly is not a good thing. In this report, we've also added something else which we didn't cover in the last 2, which are variable formula duties. So these are duties that are triggered without an investigation. They apply to maize, sugar, and wheat. And in this report, we just focus on sugar, but the principles I'm describing apply to all 3 of those. And so the way this works is if the global price of sugar drops below a particular reference price for a period of 20 days, then the duty needs to rise. And if the price rises above that reference price for 20 days, then it needs to come down. Now, importantly, there is no investigation, and this trigger should be automatic. So it should hit, and the change should simply occur. That's incredibly important. The reason these duties were set up in the first place like this is that farmers need to make decisions. Wheat is particularly sensitive here because we are not a naturally competitive wheat producer. And so if the farmers are not getting the right pricing signals, they'll put down other crops. And so that has implications. What these do is they give predictable pricing because they smooth out the peaks and troughs, assuming they're dealt with in the way that they should be, so that the net price of the product remains fairly stable and farmers can make their call. However, if we look at the last decade, this is what we find. So let me explain the slightly complicated graph to you. We look at the number of triggers that were hit and how long it took from trigger to change in the duty. Now, we know the benchmark period for this should be 30 days at most. And we know this from the 3 court cases that took place between 2016 and 17 on this very issue. In the last decade, we've had a single trigger which resulted in a duty change within the 30 days. We had 11 triggers that were missed. Most of the triggers are running quite far overdue. And so that's clearly not a good situation. It's not good for users of these commodities, not good for the farmers. The very purpose of this to create the predictability is being lost. And the effect of this is shown here. So if you look at the orange bar, this again is ITAC. So the average amount of time with ITAC is showing up in orange. And it should be a very small amount of time because it's really not that much work to push this through. Most of the time is being spent with the ministers. That's alarming because there's even less work for them to do than for ITAC to do. And the effect of these delays has been, in the last decade, an overpayment of 670 million rand in duties at times when the duty should have been lower, and an underpayment of duty of 1.5 billion rand where the duty should have been higher. And so it is an equal opportunity offender here. As you can see, it's not favoring one or the other. We even had one instance where the Minister of Finance in 2016 implemented the wrong trigger. And so that resulted in an underpayment of duties of 42 million rand and a court case. This has to be addressed because we really cannot afford our agricultural sector to suffer more than it already does. And this is designed particularly to deal with them. So the process, very much the same as the others, except everything kind of runs a hell of a lot faster. If we look at the Grain SA court case, ITAC at that point committed to 1 day from receiving the trigger to sending it off to the Minister of Trade. Minister Rob Davies was there at that time. He committed to 5 days from when he receives ITAC's note to when he sends it off to the Minister of Finance. Minister Gigaba remained intractable and refused to give such a commitment. The reality is ITAC does pretty well here. When the triggers are hit and they act on them, it takes them an average of 8 days, which is longer than the 1 day, but really still well within an acceptable tolerance. And the ministers average 70 days. But we do need to remember that a fairly significant number of triggers are simply missed. That obviously has to also be accounted for. And then we're very excited in this particular launch to also launch our very own master plan. Everyone's doing it. We're very excited that XA now also has a master plan. And the intention of this is to give a set of 11 recommendations, which we believe are all fairly easy to implement, some easier than others, and that can make an enormous difference very quickly. You're welcome to work through the detail in the report itself, but I'm going to just touch on some of the highlights in our very own master plan. The one is we truly believe we need to get rid of reciprocal agreements completely. Last time we were a little bit softer, but this time we've really thought about it. And the economic cost of these agreements so far exceeds any benefit. That certainly, to my mind, they make no sense. So these are the agreements that either ITAC or the Minister of Trade will require you to sign before the concession is given, whether it be a duty increase or reduction. This clearly does begin absorbing time. And this is stated again in ITAC's annual report. We think there need to be some regulatory amendments so the tariff regulations should implement a 12-month limit to complete all tariff investigations. Otherwise, they need to terminate. We need to likewise have a limit on the sugar and the wheat duties, etc. We need confirmation of whether reciprocal agreements were or were not signed in a case, even if the content is not made available, and the date of the signature. This is important because we thought initially that the minute the agreement was signed, it would fairly swiftly result in the duty change. But the reality is there are a number of cases which a year afterwards, we still don't have finalization. So that clearly is not enough. We think particularly duty increases need to be looked at the end of most reports where a duty has been increased. ITAC will say this should be reviewed at the end of 3 years. Sometimes that is done. There's a very long list of examples, though, when it isn't done. And we think that would make a big difference. It would bring some dynamism back into this product. It's important that people feel comfortable thinking that their concerns are looked at. We don't want our duties to lock in uncompetitive structures in the market, because companies have this perpetual protection just in perpetuity. That's the reason why those reviews should be published. And we'd like to encourage ITAC to take the initiative here and start to look at those. And kind of maybe the last important one here is the Act, we believe, needs to be amended after these court cases to more clearly define the roles of the two ministers. These roles are not clear at all in the regulations or the Act, and companies shouldn't be obliged to read through 3 arcane court cases to understand what the roles of these people are. And so we think that's kind of, those are the big ones, I guess, that we think are crucial at the moment. And then we're very excited to launch our set of dashboards, open to the public. It'll always be free. You go to our website, you can track your investigation. You can see the overall performance for the last decade. We'll be adding more and more features. So you can either just go to tools.xagta.com, you register, it's free of charge, you'll be taken straight in. You can interact with the data. You can also download a copy of the report there, or you can access it through the menu by clicking on Tariff Report, and that will take you in. So I really encourage everyone to use the dashboards, have a look at them, track what is happening at any given time, so that this process, which is so absolutely crucial, can have some participation from the public, and of course, most importantly, by companies that are negatively impacted by these delays. Michael, I am done, sir.
Thank you, Donald, and right on time as well. Thank you very much for that. There's a couple of questions here, and one kind of echoes a question that I had as well. Just looking at that chart and the timing, and it seems to coincide around 2019, 2020, which is when COVID struck. And obviously we know that introduced unprecedented challenges within global trade. So how has the pandemic impacted the timeline and process of tariff investigations in the country? And it's to Rafia Akram's point, can one blame, in inverted commas, the rise somewhat on COVID-19 in these outstanding or delayed tariff investigations?
Yeah, so I don't think we can, Rafia, maybe to a small degree, but COVID was here. It clearly impacted all of us. We would have expected it to improve after COVID then, but in fact, the situation got considerably worse after COVID. So I don't believe COVID is responsible.
If we were to look in practice at what's been happening here, and you did mention the fact that even in certain instances where reciprocal agreements have been signed, that sometimes it could take a further 12 months for the tariff decision to kick in. If you were to speculate, because a lot of this is still opaque, and we don't have full access to all the insights as to why there are these delays, what would you speculate as the key reasons behind these delays?
Yeah, so I think the reciprocal agreements are definitely part of it. Irrespective of whether the thought is that the reciprocal agreements are a good or a bad idea, the reality is that they add time to the process. And then that brings us to say, well, then the net effect of those agreements economically has to add more value than the cost imposed by putting them in place. That calculation is quite difficult to do, but my intuition at the moment is that they impose a cost far greater than the benefit they yield. We also see that we've had a couple of ministerial changes, both at finance and the Ministry of Trade. So some of that might be a result of those changes. Yeah, it's not exactly clear where that problem would sit, but I guess that's, we don't see, there's an exception here, but for the most part, ITAC's performance is fairly consistent and they turn around things fairly quickly. It does go up a little bit, but certainly in most cases, the time is spent after the investigation leaves ITAC.
And Vion de Bruin then follows on with a question here. Is the problem not with Minister Patel? It appears he's not making a decision on an investigation, specifically reduction applications. And Vion, it is noticeable that Minister Patel was appointed, I think, around 2019 as well. Donald, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, so firstly, it's certainly not just on duty reductions. It's a consistent problem, irrespective of which instrument you look at. So yes, it could be. The problem is we can't entirely tell that because there's no date separating when information left Minister Patel and then went to the Minister of Finance. So we've had to necessarily group them together as a unit and say between the two ministers, that is where the bulk of the delay is.
Well, it's certainly, I mean, I'm no lawyer, but if you look at things like PAJA and the process of just administrative action, there should certainly be an argument, compelling argument to be made for greater transparency in the process, just from where I'm sitting. Mike Benfield, just to bring you in from the coalface, so to speak. And you'll recall when I was facilitating the Steel Master Plan conference last year, I think, where the whole theme of a bring and buy again emerged around how we approach tariffs and localization. And the minister said that if we all need to be bringing our little piece, but if one of your friends at a bring and buy keeps on only bringing the peanuts while you bring in the fillet, you're obviously going to let them know. And that's why it's encouraging to have someone from business here on this panel and not just going through the usual channels of ABUSA or organized business here, because it is incumbent upon all of us, if we want to fix the system that is apparently broken, that we do raise our voices. So what has your experience been of the reciprocal agreements that you've had to potentially enter into?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. We submitted an application in 2020 around a 10% duty application on black bar for our specialty steels environment. 10%, not much in the big scheme of things. And the response was, okay, it seems justified, but we would like to have you sign the reciprocal agreement. Reciprocal agreement talked about committing to passing on the benefit downstream, okay, and committing not to retrench staff within that business unit in the future. I can't recall what the time period was, but certainly there was that type of commitment. And given the fluidity of markets and price dynamics, particularly offshore, we couldn't possibly commit to that. It's just a suicide to agree to these elements when you can't control it. China, for instance, could drop pricing dramatically for various reasons, free electricity, whatever the case may be, and their landed cost in South Africa could be 50% lower than ours. I'm being extremely ridiculous, I suppose, but the 10% wouldn't matter. And quite frankly, from our perspective, is when we apply for these duties is to protect the local manufacturer, the local industry, to get to scale, to get to maturity, to absorb, to get to higher levels of production so that we can absorb overhead and remain competitive, and then take that product and the incremental production thereafter and become competitive in the export market. Because the local economy is not big enough to sustain us any longer. We've all got excess capacity. So we needed some protection to to sort of put us on an even keel. And certainly by passing on the margin downstream, you will always be competitive. You always have to be competitive within a very dynamic market. So you can't commit to passing on margin or the benefit downstream. What's the point? Okay. Yes, you're going to gain more demand for your product, but there's many players. Okay, so there's many players who produce the same product, and that will be competitive within our space. So I found the need to sign or commit to reciprocal agreements, illogical. It didn't talk to the economic reality of it, and how quickly markets move in the face of other challenges. So to me, that's the practical issue and our stance on the matter. We weren't prepared to, and therefore our application has drifted. It's not seen the light of day.
What has this experience meant with regards to your approach now to current or future tariff applications? Because if the system's broken, it's a lose-lose type scenario.
Look, I think we as South Africans can't give up. There are these mechanisms, and we should continue trying. It costs us money to do these applications. It can't drag on like it does, but we've got to hold people accountable. We've got to hold the government structures that are there to facilitate the growth of our economy, to protect South Africans, protect local business, local products, in my view. Within the realms, the bounds of the WTO, et cetera, there's, we've committed to these things. We can't be extreme. Donald Trump did that, but the point is, I can't afford to lose hope, but at the same time, I need to hold people accountable for doing their job. Okay, so right. I think these types of webinars and reports are useful in holding the people that we vote to power accountable for what they need to do. So we will continue, but I've moved on, but we'll continue.
Mike, sometimes, and I think, the retort or the counter argument would be, or the thinking appears to be, that in the past duty concessions were given by way of some kind of additional protection or even of lowering duties, depending on which side of the problem you sit, and it benefited shareholders rather than consumers or workers. Is there any merit in this argument? Do you get that line of reasoning is coming through in the reciprocal agreements?
No, I think the focus was in the reciprocal agreements is to protect jobs in one way or another. Okay, so they say, we'll give you something, give you protection, but you've got to hold the line on employment. That's where it's coming from. I think that's the motivation, and to me, again, it's not logical. Yeah, so I can't answer any further than that.
Donald, I want to bring you in here because I think it's a good point that Mike touched on earlier, because imagine a company had requested and received a duty increase before COVID and then had to stick to its commitment through the economic nightmare of lockdowns. Mike's point was, how can I commit to things 3 years into the future when I don't have a crystal ball? Is there any kind of wiggle room for companies in a situation like this? What do we know of these reciprocal agreements when it comes to the kind of flexibility that companies have or don't have?
Yeah, so I guess a lot of it is left up to how ITAC or DTI choose to deal with non-compliance with the agreement. But if we assume that your benefits are contingent on compliance with the agreement, which is how these agreements are written, then certainly that could end poorly. We in fact asked ITAC that question quite directly maybe a year ago, and we were told, of course, they'd be reasonable and they would understand. And in fact, we used the COVID example. And I've no doubt that is absolutely true, and they would be reasonable. But we must also consider that we can't assume that the person that would be in charge 3 years from now would necessarily be quite as reasonable, and you're still tied in. So, given that we don't know what that future looks like, companies are reluctant to take a 3-year commitment on almost anything. The idea that you can commit, for example, to your pricing for the next 3 years, or you can commit to employment or investment at times of such economic chaos as we have at the moment, I think is very difficult. So I would again, I'd side with Mike on this and say it's off-putting to business. And the result of it would be, I'm guessing, less investment. If you're stuck with a raw material that attracts a duty that you can't buy locally, you may not be comfortable sitting with that liability, and maybe that expansion of your plant doesn't happen. I'm not sure that trying to contract the success of the economy is the way to go about doing this.
Yeah, free enterprise, Michael, doesn't run on that basis. We need to have choice.
Yeah.
Can't hear you,
Michael? Michael, we've lost your audio. My goodness. While we wait for Michael to sort his technology out, let me maybe just deal with some of the other questions.
Is my audio back?
Can you hear
me? Can you hear me? Yeah. Sorry, guys. I don't know what happened there. I'm using my radio equipment for Zoom, so maybe it's that. There's lots of questions coming through regarding, how we ensure accountability. How can we hold the Minister of Trade and Industry or Finance or any of the parties here accountable? Because it really is, it's a hugely frustrating process. Mike, what is your sense on how we start to ensure greater accountability? Is it through processes like this, just shining a spotlight and hoping that will lead to some kind of action?
We should have a general election. I think we just have to keep plugging away. I think there are many forums, lots of associations that interact with government, lobby government, and try and give them advice from many sectors. The Steel Master Plan is one of them. We interface with the Deputy Minister of Trade and Industry there. These are topics that come up there. And hopefully in the fullness of time, the impediments that are retarding these decisions, because I'm not quite sure what they are, we could always guess, get eliminated, and then there's a free flow of decision making. There just seems to be lots of vested interest that impacts these decisions. So I think we must just keep plugging away as South Africans and holding people accountable, and hopefully one day the government of the day will react appropriately.
Donald, just to build on that, Carolyn Reeder makes a comment and question. Says, given the sad context, is it recommended for applicants to wait until it improves? Because it's likely, and is it likely to improve anytime soon? From what Mike said, we can't give up hope here, but we don't want to be pushing coal to Newcastle.
Yeah, so I think, Caroline's question is absolutely appropriate. The reason we put this report out is that the idea of just sitting and trying to privately negotiate these things was not working. So we took the decision to put this data and these reports into the public domain so that we could move away from the ideological conversations. Is localization a good idea? If you oppose localization, you must hate South Africa. To get rid of that nonsense and instead focus on the real problem, which is an administrative problem. Now, maybe there's a policy problem, but if it takes 5 years for a decision to be taken, then we don't even get to assess the implication of the policy until 10 years has passed. So I don't think companies need to give up on this. I need to follow on what Mike said. But I do think that there must be an understanding that what is kind of written on the tin when you buy the product is not what's happening in reality. And companies need to understand that there has to be a fairly hard push to get a result out. And the result doesn't always mean that you get what you want. I mean, that's just to be very clear. ITAC has a job to do, and their job is important to assess the facts of the case. But what matters is that the process works and that you get your response. And if you are rejected, that you understand why you were rejected. And all of that happens within a good time. And we know how long it should take, because for the longest time, it consistently came in the 6-month mark. So we're not asking anything that wasn't being accomplished on a regular basis in the past. We're just saying, let's get back to where we were. And I think most people would be very happy.
What would be more important to you, Mike? Getting the tariff application you were looking for, or at least having an answer, whether it's favorable or unfavorable, within the 6-month period?
Michael, it would need to be the latter. I think, the point is valid. We're running a business and we're going to take every opportunity to position ourselves. And if we reject it, that's fine. At least we know. That's clear. We work and run our businesses within rules, within a structured society where both arguments need to be heard. And if one outweighs the other, so be it. Let's move on. And we go and take a decision around how we run our business or how we structure our business accordingly. That's the playing field in which we operate. And we try every angle possible to do that. So, that's how we do it. So obviously the latter.
When it comes to how business should engage, Maluleke and Zamande comments here that he believes structured engagement of the state is more likely to produce results. Have you had, Donald, any structured engagement with ITAC and the DTIC and the Minister of Finance over this report?
Well, we've tried. We've had conversations with ITAC, and I'm hopeful that those will yield something. DTIC, we've been attempting to secure a meeting for 6 months. To date, we've still not succeeded. Now, it could be that what we've done here makes some folk a little uncomfortable. I mean, I accept that, but the reality is no, we're not achieving anything through that engagement. I also think there's, I accept that there may be perfectly valid reasons why all of these delays are here. And we're very open to having that conversation. But the starting point is that the state has a role to play, and they have to do their job. What we're publishing here is data. We're not debating whether a given policy is a good idea or a bad idea. We're simply saying there's a problem that has to be addressed. I'm very open to sitting down for as many meetings as we need to try to find a way to resolve it. We're happy to give our recommendations, data, and anything else the state requires. But ultimately, we can't go through another set of years and years of talking and not accomplishing anything. So, we'd absolutely love to have those conversations. We've been trying to have them with no luck so far.
Well, one has to keep on knocking on the door. One can't give up here. Keith Engel comments here that he believes the problem is the length of the chain. And the law was probably designed for the minister to delegate the decision-making, and therefore it's an operational issue. The minister really should be in charge of strategy, and the finance ministry should probably also be out of the chain or have a more limited role. So the DTIC should send it. If the finance ministry doesn't object in, say, 10 days, then the decision should be deemed accepted. In your proposals, in your master plan of a way forward, does this accord or align with the way you would reform this to make it more effective?
Yes, it does. But there is a legal issue on that. And the Minister of Finance went to court 3 times to argue why his role is not a rubber stamping role. Without getting into the detail of those cases, to get to a point where that role is diminished, I think is not so much a legal issue, although it'd be good if we could have legal certainty. But we have some conflict between the tax laws and the administration of these investigations, which I think make that practically difficult. Having said that, this was never a problem again. So it's not as if the Minister of Finance suddenly has considerably more work to do than he did a decade ago. That doesn't appear to be where the problem is. So I think there has to be a commitment to doing the job efficiently and quickly. And that's really it. I don't think we can necessarily get the Minister of Finance. He certainly wasn't prepared to make a commitment in the 3 court cases. I've no reason to think that position has changed, even though the individual has changed since then.
I want to come back to the issue of the duty triggers, because the court cases involving the industry notification of duty triggers raises very interesting concerns about potential bias. And I certainly found this very interesting as an outsider. You would think that this would be managed by an independent body or agency. I don't know, maybe an ITAC. How can the government establish greater independence and transparency and reliability for identifying duty triggers and then acting on those triggers?
Yeah, so I'm not sure what the current position is, to be honest, Michael, but certainly according to the court cases, the triggers were taken to ITAC, and ITAC would then take action. That obviously creates a problem because the industry is incentivized to tell ITAC when duties go up, but not when they go down. So I think that is a fairly easy problem to solve, but I believe that calculation and tracking needs to happen inside of ITAC. Having said that, when the triggers hit, ITAC move fairly quickly. I've been critical, but the reality is ITAC are taking an average of 8 days from when the trigger hits, which is still a very reasonable amount of time. The problem, of course, is the number of missed triggers, which I think would not happen if ITAC was doing the tracking internally.
Yeah, and it follows from or follows on to a question from Woodrow Arun as well. Does ITAC have sufficient capacity to conduct tariff investigations? It would seem like from the data that you collected, the issue isn't with ITAC. It's when it leaves ITAC.
Yeah, I have no reason to think ITAC has a capacity problem. I mean, that might happen at short periods of time. Perhaps they're short of staff at certain times. But ITAC are no less capacitated now than they were a decade ago. So I don't think that's where the problem sits.
Just again, a comment here from Taffy at CIFSA. Hi, Taffy. Kudos on XA triggering the points highlighted in the duty master plan. Often business on the back foot, just responding to master plans that have already been drafted. But so well done on front loading progressive ideas. So, there seems to be lots of support, given again that we have a very diverse audience. I think that's very interesting. It's one of those things that in the US that you probably find bipartisan support on. We're not arguing around the policy on top of the cone. We're saying that the cone is broken and everything is leaking out the bottom and getting all over our fingers, and no one really does. No one wins in that environment. Mark Fine says, is it fair to compare Patel's tardiness on the duties, etc., being discussed here versus how quickly he imposes duties and restrictions on scrap metal? Mike? You're on mute.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, fair point. We have moved very quickly on scrap metal as a country, as government, and maybe we should take that as a good example of how quickly they can react to a crisis. They've taken their view on scrap metal as a means to eliminate, retard the theft of infrastructure. Some of us have a view that won't change. No matter what you do to the price of scrap. But yes, it certainly it does show how quickly they can react if there is motivation. Now, there's lots of debate about what's really motivating the decisions around scrap, and that's not for today's discussion, and nor am I going to do that publicly. But it's a good example of how quickly they can react. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. just as it looks like we've gone through the bulk of the questions that were in the Q&A, I'm going to give everyone one final chance, if they've got a question, just to type it into the box. And while we do so, maybe just some concluding thoughts, Donald, from you as to a way forward from here.
Yeah, so the conversation with government is, of course, incredibly important. We remain persistent, and we'll certainly push to have those chats. I think putting this out into the open is just an unbelievably important step. We can't have these conversations if the conversations are just about conflicting ideologies. If we can have more of these conversations that are based on the data, understanding how we can fix this process, which I have to think is in absolutely everybody's interest, no matter which side of this you're on. That's the path we've chosen to take. We're hopeful that this will begin to slowly yield positive outcomes. And also to just say, companies cannot give up on this process in the same way that a whole lot of CEOs have committed their time and money towards trying to sort out some of the problems with our logistics, etc. We can't just kind of walk away from this and say, well, it doesn't work and we're happy for it to die. And along with it, whichever businesses happen to go out of business, that's an acceptable price to pay. I don't think it is. And so we'll keep pushing, and we'd certainly encourage everyone else to certainly not give up the fight.
Mike, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think, we have a lot of vested interest in this country. We have lots of money invested everywhere. We can't give up protecting it. We've got to secure our future. And government needs to be a party to that, be a partner, to collaborate and be transparent. I think that's what we're calling for, is full transparency on decision making and why things are taking as long as they are. Can one achieve that? I think more transparency is better. I don't think we'll get full transparency, but certainly we need to move towards that ideal. Are we ever going to get there? Probably not. But I think we have to keep collaborating and partnering at all levels of society to get this country moving forward.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of jaw over war, as Churchill used to say, and this is what this is all about. At the end of the day, it's about shining a light on these things, and they do say sunlight is the best disinfectant. With that, I'd like to thank you, Mike Benfield. Thank you very much, Donald MacKay, CEO of XA Global Trade Advisors. A reminder as well that the Tariff Tracker portal, which allows anyone, it's free to view the data contained in this report, to see how long cases are open for and where the delays are sitting, are freely available at tools.xagta.com. You just have to sign up, and then once you've logged in, just choose the Tariff Tracker and off you go. And the team at XA have endeavored to keep it updated at all times. So that's their little piece that they're bringing, their little pack for the bring and buy. Thank you very much to all of you for taking the time to have this important conversation. And I certainly do hope, from my vantage point where I'm sitting, that these issues are taken seriously and we see some resolution in the not too distant future. Take care.